Hello everyone. Welcome to this lesson on the judiciary. This is part 1 because we'll be looking at the principles on which the judiciary came to be organized during the British rule in India, and that basically entails concepts like the rule of law, the separation of powers. We'll also be exploring some interesting facts such as the Ilbert Bill controversy. We'll find out what that was all about, and we'll also look at this whole idea of wearing wigs. And I think a lot of us have been enthralled by this idea of the dress code for people at that time. And so we'll find out why wigs were worn by judges or people in the legal profession. And yeah, so that's something to look forward to in the lesson, I suppose. So, first and foremost, what we do need to understand is that the colonial administration laid the foundation of a new system of dispensing justice through a hierarchy of civil and criminal courts following the principle of separation of powers. So, this was a bit different from what was being done earlier. And as regards the exact structure of the courts, the judicial organization, we'll be exploring that in the next lesson. So, no need to fret. Also, this system was neither despotic nor arbitrary, hence the term rule of law, at least not on paper. But shortly we'll find out how there was some here. Now, Montesquieu had come up with this concept of separation of powers, and by way of understanding, you need to know that he had defined three types of government. There was republican, there was monarchical, and there was despotic. So, this will also help you understand what sort of a system was being adopted by the British in India. As regards the republican system of government, the people are possessed of the supreme power. In a monarchy, a single person governs by fixed and established laws, and in a despotic one, a single person directs everything by his own will and caprice. So this was definitely not happening, and Republican government was said to be the best form of government. Montesquieu distinguishes three types of power also. So he says there has to be an executive, which is the government, then the judiciary, comprising of the judges, and the legislature, which is the people themselves. So the executive, what is it in charge of? It implements laws that are designed by the legislature, and the application of these is then entrusted to the judiciary, so interpreting them and applying them appropriately. But is this strictly followed in India? Now, this is the next important question. Also, I mean, we're veering a bit towards polity, because this is something that also applies in the current context. So, for example, when you see things like the requirement of a presidential assent for the laws, or the power of making ordinance, the power to grant pardon, or say the legislature performing judicial function while committing for contempt those who defy its orders or commit a breach of privilege. Here you may think that yes, one segment of power is flowing into another. So they are not watertight compartments, so to speak. But yes, there is a provision for an independent judiciary, and each organ is dependent on the others. So, what sort of a function do they perform? Does this entire thing perform? There is a checks and balance system, which ultimately is good for the system. The next concept is rule of law. Now, the colonial state introduced this concept. Here, you do need to understand the difference between citizens and subjects. For a long time, Indians or the natives in India under British rule were subjects. They were not treated as citizens. And in the comments, I would like you to please mention what you understand by the difference between citizens and subjects. So that will make it clearer. The rule of law meant that the administration was carried out, at least in theory, with clearly defined rights, privileges, and obligations of the Indian subjects. But there was a problem of praxis. What is praxis? Praxis essentially means the application of a theory, or learning by doing something, doing an act. So it basically applies the principles on paper to real life. But the problem of praxis here was that it was noticed that this was not all that was happening during the British rule here. So there was a rule of law, there was supposed to be equality before the law, but that was not being implemented in strict spirit. For the longest time, only Europeans could try Europeans. There was an inherent racist bias that used to pervade the system. And a lot of times, many European elites who were traders, who were merchants, who were planters, you could read about, in fact, the Indigo revolt, and read about Deenbandhu Mitra's play Neel Darpan, in which he has shown how this kind of bias used to work. So a lot of times European judges used to favor their European counterparts, and that was of course not a good system to be in, legally speaking. But what was the positive outcome of the rule of law? It was that it did extend a guarantee of personal liberty of a person. So earlier, there was not a very strict rule of law. Here, rule of law meant that the government was also subject to the rule of law. Like I said, at least on paper. Okay, so this was something that was happening. It was not arbitrary anymore. Also, the role of divine law was curtailed to a great extent, because now you spoke about laws that were effectively passed by through proper deliberation in the legislature. Under colonial rule, despite inherent limitations, the administration was largely carried on according to laws interpreted by courts. And again, what is very important here is the difference between common law and civil law. As we all know, we've come to function as a common law system, similar to what England does, and this is what common law essentially is, when you have a canon of interpretation of various laws by the courts. Now, A.V. Dicey was in fact instrumental behind this concept of rule of law, and there was this book of his, The Law of the Constitution 1885, wherein there were three implications of the doctrine of rule of law, and you can read about them. The first is the absence of arbitrary power, which basically means that no man is punished except for a breach of law. So there will be no arbitrariness. There will be clear criterion for when you can actually be punished. Equality before the law, which we will read about shortly, equal subjection of all citizens to the ordinary law of the land administered by ordinary law courts, and the last one being the predominance of the legal spirit, which is that the constitution is the result of rights of an individual as defined and enforced by courts of law, and the constitution is not the source of individual rights. So it's not the other way around, right? So what we look at now is the relevance of the rule of law, which is demonstrated by application of the following principles in practice. But when I read them out, keep thinking about how much of it was actually being implemented during the British regime from what you have read and heard. So there was separation of powers between the legislature, executive and judiciary, law being made by representatives of the people in an open and transparent way. And remember the term representatives of the people. I'm mentioning the Simon Commission here. Please read and find out why it is relevant to this point. Then the law and its administration being subject to open and free criticism by the people who may assemble without fear. Again, we know that there are a lot of controversies surrounding this, ranging from the Jallianwala Bagh massacre to the law on sedition, etc., etc. The law is applied equally and fairly so that no one is above the law. Again, questionable during the British era. The law is capable of being known to everyone so that everyone can comply. This was a challenge for Indian subjects. No one is subject to any action by a government agency other than the law and model litigant rules, and no one is subject to any torture. The judicial system is independent, impartial, open and transparent, providing a fair and prompt trial. All people are presumed to be innocent until proven otherwise and are entitled to remain silent and not required to incriminate themselves, principles that have been incorporated in the law in India. And no one can be prosecuted civilly or criminally for any offence not known to the law when committed. Now, as regards equality before the law, all men were equal in the eyes of the law. This is what it meant. The law applied to all persons irrespective of their primordial identities and class. This was a bit of a change because earlier there were several factors that were affecting the application of laws in India based on caste, based on religion, based on gender, and all this was sought to be eliminated. Now, what does primordial identity mean? Primordial is something that is ascribed to you upon birth, essentially. And find out about this term called luck egalitarianism. This is also a related concept which basically says that, things like your religion, things like your race, things like your community are to a great extent a stroke of luck where you are born. So, making them a criteria for any kind of formal legal treatment would be unfair. Despite this, Europeans and their descendants had the privilege of separate courts and even laws. I have mentioned this before, and the practice was criticized by several enlightened and humanist officials, including British ones. Also, the new system had certain problems. It created legal inequalities because people needed a lot of money. The laws were not very easy to understand for the Indians, majority of them still not being literate, and there was elitism that had crept in because of the reason that people who had money could afford to get through the legal system in a proper way. Now comes the Ilbert Bill controversy. This is a very interesting episode that happened somewhere in 1882, 83 essentially, where the legal member of the Governor General of India's Council, who was Sir Courtenay Peregrine Ilbert, he introduced a bill to amend the Code of Criminal Procedure, 1882, as regards the exercise of jurisdiction over European British subjects. This came to be known as the Ilbert Bill after him. So you need to remember this. And this was during the viceroyship of the Marquis of Ripon. As per the bill, British and European subjects could be tried by Indian judges in sessions courts, which was not the case earlier. Now, there was a huge furor around this. Indians, of course, welcomed this measure because they felt it was a welcoming gesture by the British. And some British officials who were on the council themselves said that, Indian officials are also the eyes and ears of the British government in India, and therefore they should be accorded that kind of position and respect. But there was a lot of controversy as well, for obvious reasons, and there was an open show of racism when it came to this particular bill. Europeans and people in Britain, a majority of them were against this because they did not feel that Indian judges could be completely unbiased when trying European subjects. And they felt that they were prone to corruption and so on and so forth. So, following this controversy, Viceroy Ripon was actually compelled to pass an amendment where a jury of 50% of Europeans was required if an Indian judge was to face a European on the dock. And the compromise that was finally adopted was that the jurisdiction to try Europeans was conferred on European and Indian district magistrates and sessions judges as well. But a defendant had the right to claim trial by jury in all cases, of which at least half the members had to be European. So they sort of sought to offset any sort of concerns that were arising. So to end with, we talk about why were wigs worn by judges back then. You'd be surprised to know that wigs actually made their first appearance in a courtroom by virtue of a social custom. This is because during the reign of Charles II, wigs had been made essential wear for polite society. Wigs were not easily adopted by the judiciary until 1685. There are plenty of portraits of judges back in those days where they're sporting their natural original hair instead of the wigs, so they were not quite happy with the idea. Anyway, as luck would have it, the reign of George III saw wigs gradually go out of fashion. So judges wore only full-bottomed wigs until the 1780s, and then there was this less formal version that came onto the scene, and they started wearing those for civil trials. The full-bottomed wig continued to be worn for criminal trials until the 1840s, but is today reserved for ceremonial dress. And smaller wigs are used on a day-to-day basis in the United Kingdom. Okay, so in the comments, please mention the difference between citizens and subjects. And in tomorrow's lesson, we'll also look at the deal with robes. So we're going along exploring the dress code as well, just to make it a bit more interesting. Thank you.